Welcome everyone to Cocktails and Crime Analysis. My name is Charlie Gibberti, joined as always by Jason Elder and Cassie Langdon, my loyal co-hosts. And tonight's episode is all about ShotSpotter. Is it the magic bullet to end all crime? Does it not work at all? We brought in two experts to discuss the issue. Our first is Tom Chittum. Tom is a graduate of UNLV Law School and spent over 23 years at ATF, starting as a criminal investigator and retiring as the chief operating officer of the agency. He currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Forensic Services for SoundThinking, formerly ShotSpotter, and is an adjunct law professor at UNLV's Boyd School of Law. So, Tom, we'll start by asking you the big question. What are you drinking?
Well, I'm an old-fashioned guy in more ways than one. More importantly, I'd like to point out my glass has the ATF badge embossed on it.
Nice. So no one from ATF is going to have a problem with you drinking on the show, right?
Well, the agency is known for the firearms and explosives, but where it really shines is with the alcohol.
What's your bourbon brand, since you're an old-fashioned man?
Well, so that's another thing. I actually live in Kentucky, and when you retire from ATF, you get gobs and gobs of booze from people. So I have an assortment of bourbon that keeps me going for a while.
I lived in northern Kentucky very briefly, and that was my absolute favorite part of being there, was the bourbon trail.
Yeah.
And our other guest is no stranger to the crime analysis field, Eric Piza, Ph.D., is a professor of criminology and criminal justice, director of crime analysis initiatives, and co-director of the Crime Prevention Lab at Northeastern University. His research agenda focuses on the spatial analysis of crime patterns, evidence-based policing, crime control technology, and the integration of academic research and police practice. Dr. Piza has published over 65 peer-reviewed journal articles and 3 books. He's also been very involved with the IACA in the past, as well as MACA, teaching courses on GIS for the association and making perennial appearances at their annual conference. And, of course, the highest honor he or anyone could ever receive, his textbook, Modern Policing Using ArcGIS Pro, is listed as recommended reading on the BDE Analytics website. So, Eric, thanks for dropping by. Same question to you. What are you drinking tonight?
Thank you for having me. I'm having a little single malt Glenlivet. Busted out the 21 year for special occasions, and there are no more special occasions than being invited on crime analysis and cocktails.
I'm glad you recognize the honor that's being bestowed upon you by being here tonight. All right, guys, so we'll get right into it. Tom, we'll start off with you. For those crime analysts who have been living in a cave for the last couple of years, can you just give us a quick rundown of what exactly is ShotSpotter, how does the technology work, and how do you guys market it? What's the goal when you go into agencies?
So ShotSpotter is acoustic gunshot detection. And if you had asked me to explain how it worked before I came to work here, I'd have had to guess it was powered by magic. Because how could it possibly do what it says it does? I've learned it is not magic at all. It is basic math, science, and technology harnessed for public safety good. What we do is spread sensors out over an area that has suffered high rates of gun crime. When guns are fired, they make a loud noise that travels out in all directions, and the sound hits our sensors at different times. By measuring the time difference of arrival at each of those sensors, we can calculate where the gunfire came from. We notify police so they can respond quickly and precisely to render aid to gunshot wound victims, to arrest offenders, to recover important ballistic evidence that's often left behind, to reassure their time of need. And all of that happens in less than 60 seconds, from the time of gunfire to the time we publish our alert. However, the real value of the technology comes from the chronic underreporting of gunfire in places that have suffered from it the most. We know that a lot of gunfire goes unreported through 911. Even when someone does call 911, the information they have to offer is often imperfect and incomplete, and ShotSpotter helps fill that gap.
That's an interesting point. So in areas where you've put this technology in, can you give us some sense of how much police should expect the rate of reported gunfire to jump after they have ShotSpotter? So In other words, like what percentage of gunshots do you find are actually being reported before ShotSpotter goes in?
So it varies. Research suggests about 80%, and our experience across a lot of customers suggests that is accurate. So you're talking about 4 out of 5 incidents being unreported to police. And the reasons why that is true vary. Some of them are practical. Gunfire happens in the middle of the night when normal people are sleeping. You get awakened by something, you don't know what it is, so you don't call police. But sometimes it's because these communities have grown numb to the sound of gunfire. They hear it so much, they have resigned themselves to living with it. They think that police don't care about them. They fear retaliation if they're seen cooperating with police, or they assume someone else will call but no one else does. And so a large portion of gunfire that occurs in certain communities goes unreported for those reasons and others.
So what are the goals that police departments are trying to achieve whenever they buy and implement ShotSpotter? What are the major deliverables?
Well, you have to ask each police department that, and I think that'll be a big part of the discussion we have tonight. ShotSpotter as a technology is just one tool in the toolbox, but how you use it will influence the results that you see from it, and the goals that you have from it for it can influence how you implement it. And what we have seen is implementation is a very important part of using this technology, as it is with using any technology.
Now, Eric, I see you writing, you're either taking fastidious notes of what Tom's saying or you're publishing your 66th journal article right here live on the show. You did recently publish a little article on the effectiveness of ShotSpotter, and I have a real quick question about this. I'm actually going to throw this up on the screen. You guys won't see it, but the guests will. The header of this report says National Criminal Justice Reference Service, and then you have the logos for Office of Justice Programs, BJA, BJS, NIJ, OJJDP, OVC, and SMART. Was there anybody that did not give you money to study ShotSpotter?
Yeah, the only agency out of that list that funded the research project was the National Institute of Justice. Right. I think since the final report was placed on the OJP site, they have to put all of the OJP agencies on the logos on the webpage. If those other agencies would like to send us money to keep studying ShotSpotter, I'm not opposed to it.
I saw that and I just thought everybody wanted a piece of Eric Piza. Everybody wanted to be part of journal article number 66. All right, so you recently published some studies. You were looking specifically at Kansas City and Chicago, and you were evaluating, we'll call it the efficacy of ShotSpotter. So can you tell us a little bit about the motivation to do this research, your methodology, and ultimately what you found?
Yeah, let me start with the motivation. So this goes all the way back to 2019. Actually, the Kansas City Police Department, who I've been actively involved with research with going back over a decade at this point, approached me about evaluating their ShotSpotter system. So they installed ShotSpotter in about a 3.5 square mile area in 2012, and before deciding whether or not to expand it, they were looking for someone to evaluate the program just so they could approach it with a little bit more scientific evidence than they would have otherwise. While preparing that proposal, I reestablished contact with a deputy superintendent in Chicago that I had known a while ago, and he said that despite Chicago doing the opposite, Chicago did not stick to a very small target area. They grew from 3 square miles to over 136 square miles over about a 5-year period. But he was also of the opinion that an evaluation would be beneficial to the city. So we applied for funding from the National Institute of Justice. We were fortunate enough that NIJ did select our proposal for funding. And with that funding, we were able to conduct what we believe, my colleagues and I believe, is the largest study on ShotSpotter to date. So we had 15 years worth of data from both cities. We had 15 years worth of crime data, calls for service, arrest, ShotSpotter activations. We had AVL data, so automated vehicle locator data. Crime analysts who are probably the audience for this program are probably aware of what that is. For anyone unaware with what AVL data is and a podcast catered towards the crime analysis community. We probably don't have too many people unfamiliar, but if anyone doesn't know, essentially those are the GPS trackers in patrol vehicles. So for both Kansas City and Chicago, we were able to measure precisely where patrol vehicles were on a 15-second increments. We've submitted our final report to we've submitted our final report to NIJ, and we've also published findings from this project across 5 peer-reviewed journal articles. We have 5 main findings that I'll try to go through quickly here. If you need me to hurry up, just feel free to tell me.
Nah, take your time.
Be careful saying that to a professor, right? I mean, we'll be here for 90 minutes, and no one else would speak.
All right, well, explain your 5 points in 12 words or less then.
There we go. All right,
Yeah.
That's more like it. So we essentially found, again, 5 main findings. I kind of like to separate these into procedural factors and outcome factors. So the first procedural factor that we were able to measure had to do with police officer detection and response to gunfire. And to be frank, we found that ShotSpotter did deliver a number of potential benefits. So on average, ShotSpotter alerts come in about 93 seconds before the first 911 call reporting that event. So a 93-second head start to a potential shooting is never a bad thing. Police officers responded quicker to ShotSpotter alerts than they did respond to 911 calls for service reporting gunfire. And we also found, using the GPS data, that police officers stopped their vehicles on scene more often when responding to ShotSpotter alerts, and also stopped their vehicles closer to the actual crime scene when responding to ShotSpotter alerts. We also looked at this question of increased enforcement, specifically we also looked at this question of increased enforcement with an emphasis on whether or not communities of color are over-policed and over-subjected to punishment in response to ShotSpotter. What we found was that ShotSpotter alerts were associated with an increased likelihood of arrest and pedestrian stops in the 15 minutes and 1,000 feet surrounding a ShotSpotter alert. However, we found the same thing for 911 calls for service, right? So when someone picks up the phone and calls the police to report the sound of a gunshot, also increased likelihood that someone will be stopped or arrested within 15 minutes and within 1,000 feet. Interestingly, we also found that finding held across different types of arrests and stops. And also importantly for this debate, or at least the public debate going on, we also found that same finding held across different racial groups of suspects. So essentially, we found that ShotSpotter really did not increase the chance for enforcement as compared to 911 calls for service.
I think that
Go ahead.
It's in our kind of pre-discussions leading up to that, we kind of threw out the issue of stop and frisk and that there being some civil rights concerns. But I mean, qualitatively, when you think of stop and frisk, at least the way that it's portrayed very often in the media, it's kind of like this nebulous reason for stopping somebody. But if you've got reliable machinery going off saying that a gun just went off in this area at this time, and you're close and you're there pretty quickly, I don't know. Is that seems like it's already pretty close to reasonable suspicion for justifiable stop and frisk.
I agree, right? Because I was in New York City during the time of the NYPD's stop, question, frisk controversy, and that was, in my opinion, a different issue altogether, right? That was police officers oftentimes, as was proven in a court of law, using a pretty low bar for articulating reasonable suspicion to stop and frisk individuals. Officers responding to ShotSpotter alerts, right? I mean, the sound of a potential gunshot is something that is it does raise the bar significantly when we talk about determining or providing reasonable suspicion to stop and interrogate people on the street.
Be interested to hear Tom's opinion on this, just coming from the sworn side versus a research analyst side.
So I worked my entire career at ATF as an agent, but I'm also an attorney. And when I was at ATF, I had read exactly one case involving ShotSpotter. It involved ATF agent who was shot by a gang member in Chicago. A gang member shot him in the head. He survived miraculously. I believe he is indestructible. And so that was the only time I had ever read about ShotSpotter being used in court. When I came to the company, though, I found that there's a lot of case law about ShotSpotter, basically everything that there is. And ShotSpotter shows up in court in a few different ways. But with respect to stop and frisk, if you look at the case law writ large, courts consistently say that a ShotSpotter alert is one factor that's an appropriate and unique factor to be assessed along with other factors in establishing reasonable suspicion of criminal activity. But it must be considered alongside other factors like suspect behaviors, unprovoked flight, nervousness, evasiveness, person blading their body away, attempting to conceal what might be a firearm. But it should be considered alongside other things too, like witnesses when police arrive on the scene, whether they find ground truth, do they see casings, bullet holes that corroborate gunfire has occurred. And what you find, looking at the case law, is ShotSpotter is very often the first event, not including the shooting itself, in a series of events that lead to arrests for gun violations. This makes sense, and I think it's confirmed by Eric's research that ShotSpotter often leads to more arrests than 911 alone. So it's an important tool. I think the problem is some critics believe that ShotSpotter blankets an area with reasonable suspicion, and that's just not how the technology works, and that's not how the case law is. And I think that's also a cynical view of law enforcement. I think that police try to play by the rules. And stop and frisk is an important tool, or stop, question, and frisk, as sometimes I hear it called, as Eric referred to it there, where police must assess the circumstances based on the totality of what they find. Stop and frisk works. We don't want dangerous people carrying guns. Police go out and try to identify dangerous people. And they want to increase the deterrent effect by making those dangerous people believe there's a strong likelihood that they will get caught with that illegal gun. But there is a cost to that sort of indiscriminate policing. What we see is very aggressive use of that sort of tactic really decreases support for law enforcement. And that is a real problem because law enforcement legitimacy is absolutely essential to its effectiveness. Very often in these communities, people know who's responsible for shootings, but if they don't believe police will use their information effectively, if they don't believe that they are just, they won't cooperate, and that's a real problem. I think there's promising research that shows things like procedural justice can help ameliorate some of the negative downsides to stop and frisk policing. And I wrote a blog recently. Procedural justice, in my mind, is just common sense and a little bit of good old-fashioned fairness and common courtesy, explaining to people what they're doing. The real challenge for law enforcement is identifying those people that are dangerous and are carrying firearms from people who might just be going about their business. I do think that technology can help with that. ShotSpotter gives them a precise location to go to. And I think it's worth pointing out without ShotSpotter on a random 911 call. Very often callers don't have much information to offer. I heard what sounds like gunfire. I think it came from out front, but they can't say if it's on this block or 2 blocks over, a couple of blocks over. And so what are police to do but to roam around searching? And I think that is far more likely to lead to this indiscriminate canvassing as opposed to ShotSpotter, which tells you a precise place to go to.
The procedural justice angle is really interesting because I know one of the selling points that ShotSpotter stresses is when people hear gunshots and no one shows up, there's this idea that police don't care. And so I know that the company encourages police to respond to the area, knock on doors, and spread the awareness that they're aware, that they're in the neighborhood, that they care, spreading this sort of idea of safety. Eric, I want to throw it back to you really quick. your study did not cover perceptions of police or police legitimacy or anything like that, but it did cover effectiveness, case closures, crime prevention, things like that.
Yes.
So what were you able to find in terms of those things?
Yeah, certainly. So looking at the outcome measures of our study, we found three main things. One, we found that ShotSpotter alerts were more often to be classified as unfounded by responding police officers as compared to 911 calls. So the exact statistic is gunshot detection alerts, or ShotSpotter alerts rather, are 15% more likely to be classified as unfounded by the officers as compared to 911 calls, right? So essentially the officers respond, they find no physical evidence on scene, no one comes out of their house to say that they heard a gunshot. So essentially there's nothing on scene that leads the officer to believe that a legitimate sound of gunfire occurred. There's a number of reasons.
Question
Yes,
on
yes,
that.
yes.
Is that separate from false alarms?
Well, that's a great question, right? And there's a number of potential explanations for that finding. To be perfectly honest, we don't have the data to say which explanation is the best, but I think one explanation potentially is that maybe not each one of these ShotSpotter alerts are legitimate sounds of gunfire. To be clear, there's other potential explanations, right? Maybe revolvers, for example, right? Revolvers are not going to leave evidence on the ground. People shot at but not struck are not very likely to cooperate with law enforcement. That's another thing that can lead to an unfounded disposition. But whatever the cause, it's present in the ShotSpotter area and absent in the control areas. Right? So if you want to tell me that revolvers are the reason for that finding, then you need to show me that revolvers are used more often in the ShotSpotter area than other places. If you're going to tell me that uncooperative victims are the reason for that finding, then there needs to be reason to think that victims are going to be more cooperative in other high crime places of Kansas City. So again, we don't know exactly why that is, but we could kind of discuss a number of potential explanations. The two other main findings, and I could do these pretty quick because we found the same exact thing in both cities. So in both Kansas City and Chicago, ShotSpotter did not lead to any reduction of gunshot victimization. In Kansas City, we did find a 22% reduction of reports of sounds of gunfire. However, no incidents involving actual gunshot victims were reduced in Kansas City. In Chicago, we found no reductions of anything. So there was no reduction of gunshot victimization or reported sounds of gunfire. We also found that shooting incidents in both Kansas City and Chicago were no more likely to be cleared by arrest in ShotSpotter areas compared to the control areas. So Tom, I had to correct one thing you said. You mentioned before that my research found that ShotSpotter increased arrest. That's not totally accurate. So we found that there was no increase in case clearance in either city in the ShotSpotter area.
And that's
You did
after
mention that-
follow-up investigation, not just initial calls for service?
Yeah, that focused on retroactive investigations.
So you did mention that police are more likely to spend more time on scene with a ShotSpotter activation as opposed to somebody calling 911 and calling in shots fired. Was that correct?
That is correct, and I forget if I mentioned this, so apologies if I did with the technical difficulties, but we found that another benefit of ShotSpotter that officers collect ballistic evidence more often from ShotSpotter alerts than 911 calls. But again, I have to kind of repeat the last finding that despite the increased collection of ballistic evidence, and we also found an increase of gun recoveries in ShotSpotter areas, neither of those seems to have led to increased case clearance. So cases aren't being solved any more often, even though ShotSpotter is leading to more evidence on scene.
Sounds like police have a big distrust of 911 callers. Right?
Yeah, I could say
they don't seem to spend much time. They're not spending it. They almost don't see. It almost sounds like it's less legitimate if it's a 911 call as opposed to ShotSpotter.
I'd say as a patrol officer, I answered numerous shots fired calls, and it's fireworks or, a car backfiring or, dog barking. So I could understand the ideology that, hey, this piece of technology is shown to be more accurate, having a little bit more sense of, hey, this is a legit call, than, the tendency to have that complacency issue.
Yeah, certainly. And a lot of police officers I've spoken with, they've communicated that when something comes through over the ShotSpotter system, they do tend to give it the benefit of the doubt. Being able to listen to the audio, being able to pinpoint exactly where the shooting occurred by looking at the map that the ShotSpotter app provides, officers do communicate to me that they do find that pretty valuable.
Yeah, that's a big difference with a machine that says the shot was exactly here versus somebody saying, I heard shots, and then you roll through the area and there's nobody lying bleeding, there's nobody saying there he is, there's nobody running and screaming. How long are you going to circle that area looking for a casing before you just get 10-8 versus, the ShotSpotter says exact lat and long, it's right here. And then you show up and it's either there or it's not. So Eric, kind of going back to your statement about the number of calls and recoveries and whatnot, does your estimate of, well, I guess I quite don't know how to ask this question, but at the beginning of the show we talked about how 80% of shots fired aren't recovered or aren't reported to police, and then we put ShotSpotter in the area, we can hear more. Does your research back that up? Or do you guys have a different estimate? Do you think that number, whenever you start to look at calls for service that are validated versus those that aren't, and ShotSpotter activations that are validated versus those that aren't, do you find that 20% number is accurate, or is it different?
To be honest, we didn't have the data to directly comment on that, so I'm a little iffy about giving a definitive statement, but the fact that sounds of shots fired are more likely to be classified as unfounded when they're reported by ShotSpotter, I think warrants at least a discussion around that 80% figure and exactly what was the methodology around the research that reports that 80% figure.
Can you dive a little deeper into that? Because it seems counterintuitive that they're more likely to be unfounded, yet more likely to also result in the recovery of a casing or a gun. That would seem to mean that it was not unfounded. So how can both of those things be true at the same time?
Good question. So I think both of those things could be true because on the cases that are legitimate, it seems the officers are essentially the efficiency of the officers is heightened in those cases. So probably due to things like the pinpoint location, due to things like being able to listen to the gunshots, the sound of gunshots, hearing how many rounds were fired, for an example. When it is a legitimate shooting, it seems that police officers are more efficient at locating evidence.
So what you're saying is that with both calls for service where somebody's saying there are shots fired and with ShotSpotter activations, a very small percentage of both, a large percentage of both are being closed unclassified, or are being closed unfounded.
I'm saying that, so when reporting sounds of gunfire, not gunshot victimization, right? Because obviously if an officer responds and there's a shooting victim on the ground, it's a founded shooting.
Right.
Right. So this is reports of sound of gunfire. When someone picks up the phone and calls 911 to report that, the likelihood that the responding officer classifies the case as unfounded is 15% lower in 911 calls as compared to ShotSpotter alerts. So ShotSpotter is increasing the likelihood that police officers, in Kansas City at least, right? We weren't able to explore this research question in Chicago. ShotSpotter is increasing the likelihood that responding police officers are classifying incidents as unfounded.
Okay. So there's more calls for service, but they're also, the unfounded rate is increasing with the calls for service rate.
Yes.
Gotcha. Okay. Thanks for getting us there. We appreciate you.
I have a question about terrain, because you're dealing with two cities in the Midwest, and that might that probably was to your advantage, Eric. But even Tom, I'm guessing that certain terrain factors during the implementation have an impact on ShotSpotter and maybe its effectiveness.
Well, this technology seems newfangled, and it certainly is sophisticated, but it uses well-established principles. The way sound propagates, its speed, the effect of the environment on sound. And so all of that goes into consideration when we deploy our system. And so each deployment is custom. And so in a place like Pittsburgh, where you have more rolling terrain, it's going to be different than in Las Vegas. But the system as it's deployed accounts for those things. It really does take into a lot of information. And a couple of the other things about the technology that are worth highlighting, and Eric mentioned it several times, each of our alerts is accompanied by an audio recording of the sound that it is that we capture. So unlike police who get a call through 911 and they just have to trust that the person who also probably does not have a recording and can't listen to it themselves is gunfire, with us they get an audio recording of it. And in fact, that audio recording very often turns out to be evidence that is used in court. It is the gunfire that killed a victim. It's also the way we've been able to quantify the pretty significant increase in the use of automatic weapons to commit crimes. Because we're actually hearing the gunfire, we distinguish semi-automatic from fully automatic gunfire. And we know that machine guns have proliferated, especially because of a small switch that's often installed on Glock-type pistols. And we think there's value in that tactical information. As you point out, police officers very often say that they like responding to ShotSpotter alerts. I think it's because they have practical experience with it. They know that they are likely to recover evidence. They know that it documents a likely very serious crime, and so they give it the priority it deserves. And so we have very strong support across the law enforcement base. And frankly, I think that that's a sign that the system is effective. If we became the burglar alarm of gunshot detection, where cops said, this is probably nothing, disregard, they would stop using it. But that is not the experience that we see.
So when one of these alerts come in, how is it validated, or is it validated?
So there's a big misperception that our system simply hears loud sounds and sends it to the police, and that's not at all how it works. It does detect and locate loud, impulsive sounds that occur in the environment, like gunfire. It will detect other impulsive sounds too, things like fireworks, but that's only the first step. We do use sophisticated algorithms to filter out sounds that are not likely gunfire. Sounds that are then characteristic of gunfire go through a human reviewer that uses a lot of other information to make their assessment. People think that we only use our ears, that somehow we're just listening to an audio clip and saying, oh, that sounded more like gunfire than fireworks, but that's not right. We also use our ears and we listen for clues that something is gunfire, like the cadence of gunfire, the consistent, steady pulse strength of gunfire, or pulses that don't overlap. We're listening for audio clues that something is not gunfire, like the whistling, sizzling, or popping of fireworks, or the rev of an engine that precedes a backfire. But we're also looking at a lot of other data too. Sound propagates omnidirectional. It spreads in all directions at the same speed, but gunfire tends to be very directional. And so we look at the pattern of sensors that participate in detecting it to say, hey, is this a circular, or is it more linear or conical? And we look at other data too, contextual clues, proximal events, and that sort of thing. Through all that filtering, then we only publish incidents that we believe are gunfire. The system is not perfect. Show me a technology that is, but we do maintain a high accuracy rate, and I think it's the reason our customer retention is so high. In the pre-show, you asked about customers who have discontinued service. And I'm sure that we'll get to that. But I think what you're going to see when we do is that far more customers depend on ShotSpotter, trust it as reliable, and think of it as an important part of their public safety strategy than those who have decided it's not an important part.
That's actually a really great question for Eric. So, Eric, I know that we kind of get into the stats and the quantitative and the test the hypothesis and what's the conclusion, but you probably spent a lot of time with representatives from both Chicago PD and Kansas City. What were their impressions? Were they expecting you to come out and say that this is really great? Did they the boots on the ground say, well, yes, but to some of your findings, what's the perception among law enforcement?
That's a really good question. And to be frank, I have more of an insight. I could give a much better answer to that question on the Kansas City side than the Chicago side. No fault of the city of Chicago, but a quick 30-second history of this project in Chicago. The deputy superintendent that I mentioned earlier that asked to be part of the project, he retired literally like a week after we got notification that we were awarded the grant. The deputy superintendent he passed me off to retired like a month after that. This was in 2020, right? We all remember what happened. Yeah, so we all remember what happened in 2020. We all thought the world was going to end, so we really didn't pick back up on the project until 2021. And by that point, I had very few, if any, institutional connections at Chicago left. So it wasn't until after we actually had findings that I was able to make a presentation to the leadership over there. In Kansas City, we had an open dialogue with the leadership from the very beginning. Every single time we generated preliminary research findings, we made a point to present it to the police chief and also to the command staff. We got feedback from them about what they thought explained some of our research findings. They asked some really good questions that led us to run some additional models and maybe tweak some of the statistics just to verify that the findings were robust. Made a couple of public presentations in Kansas City in open public forums in front of the city council and in front of the board of police directors. So given that, we heard a lot of perspectives, right? I mean, some champions of the system, right, kind of despite the findings about the lack of effect on crime prevention and case clearance, would always push back a little bit about like there's just, there's benefits that the research can't measure. To be perfectly frank, there's people within the police department that are on the complete opposite side of that and kind of feel like the results maybe verify the city should maybe, if not disinvest from the system, maybe not expand it any further. But to Kansas City's credit, it's a very healthy dialogue. No one side of the debate is shunned in favor of the other. So we've really benefited from hearing a lot of different perspectives from people within the police department and also within the larger city government in Kansas City.
Tom, is there like a golden child ShotSpotter customer, the one that you always cite?
Well, there are a lot of really good users of ShotSpotter, but they're not all equal, and I think that raises an important point. So as I said before, this is a tool. And how you use it determines the results you will see. If you buy a treadmill and you hang your laundry on it to dry, you will not get healthy from it. If you get on it and run every day, you're going to see different results. And we see that here too. ShotSpotter is going to increase the amount of gunfire you know about. That means you're going to have to increase your responses. You have to have a plan for using it. Simply having it doesn't solve any problems. It really does require an investment of resources to use it effectively. And so, we see differences across the country. I wouldn't point to any single police department, but there are, it's just one thing or another. So this actually raises an issue that I think is an important law enforcement thing across the profession. You mentioned before, Charlie, one other benefit of ShotSpotter is it allows police to respond out and reassure the community. And so when I'm talking to people about the best way to use it, one of the things I say is, even if you show up and you don't find a victim and you don't find a suspect, and even if you don't find evidence, it's worth knocking on doors and saying, hey, we got a report of gunfire. We just want to make sure that everyone is okay. Did you see anything? Did you hear anything? If you call us, we will come. We just want you to know that we're out here and we care. I think that is true, and I think those low friction contacts can help really increase trust and confidence in law enforcement. But that is a luxury. Show me a police department that has spare time on its hands. And if we lived in a law enforcement paradise where police could pursue every lead to the end, I think we would see a lot more effectiveness. That's easier said than done. But it's not just true of ShotSpotter, it's true of other technologies too. So I mentioned when I was at ATF, I saw an evolution in what ATF calls, and a lot of other law enforcement now calls, crime gun intelligence. Reliable sources of information that law enforcement and intel analysts can use to identify shooters and firearms traffickers, the people that are pulling the trigger and the people that are arming them. In the past, law enforcement was largely sort of by the gut, or it was informant-led. Now we've got these other tools that we can use. Chief among them, from ATF's perspective, is ballistic imaging. It's National Integrated Ballistic Information Network, or NIBIN. Right? This system takes images of casings recovered at crime scenes, or images of casings from test fires of guns recovered, and matches them. And so it makes connections between crime scenes that may have gone undetected before, increasing the universe of leads that investigators have to follow. But that's in a perfect world. You have to have the time to do that. You have to have investigators who know how to do that. And so I really do think over time, law enforcement will get better. That's the nature of progress. I think technology that automates layering these sources of intelligence can make it better. And so to your original question, do we see customers who use the tool better than others? Yes. And those are places that have a comprehensive strategy that focus the resources on using these tools in layers, not just one single thing, because there's no panacea for gun violence, but putting all of these tools together to use them to their greatest effect.
Yes, I kind of have two questions. One for Eric, since you work so closely with Kansas City, how were they implementing the tool? What were some, I guess, methodologies of follow-up that specifically related to ShotSpotter? And for Tom, you talked about officers going out and knocking on these doors, and these are in neighborhoods that we already know are high crime areas, tend to have lower ideas of the police, and so are officers really doing that, and is that really appreciated by them? Because I know in some areas where we had ShotSpotter, they would not have appreciated us knocking on the door if we didn't have a reason to be there. So
Yeah, so in Kansas City, first of all, I should mention that they have a really, really strong crime gun intelligence center in Kansas City. They implemented it, I believe, in 2014, and they've since made a number of improvements to the point where the Bureau of Justice Assistance has highlighted them as one of the model gun crime intelligence centers in the nation. So that's probably where the ShotSpotter system was most integrated with day-to-day policing. So since they have the Gun Crime Intelligence Network, they were able to get their shell casings into NIBIN quicker. They were able to get quicker turnaround time than labs in a lot of other cities around the country are probably able to do. So that's one area where the ShotSpotter was closely integrated and probably improved operations. Again, not to be this guy to keep coming back to this finding, though, I have to repeat that none of that led to any increase in shootings being solved any more often, right? So I like to just throw that caveat out there just to make sure that, the collection of evidence doesn't necessarily mean that investigations are going to be improved. As far as the recommendations that Tom made about officers taking time to canvass shooting scenes, try to identify witnesses, knock on doors to reassure people that the police are there and they're taking gunfire seriously, Kansas City, unfortunately, falls into the less than perfect category where they're a highly stressed agency, low resourced, high crime, and they, to my knowledge, weren't in the position to allow their officers the time to spend that much time on shooting scenes canvassing. So to my knowledge, none of those types of improvements or policies rather were integrated on the patrol level specific to ShotSpotter. So they responded to ShotSpotter alerts in the same way that they would respond to gunfire reported by different means.
So you asked the question about going outdoors. I had somebody say to me recently, wow, ShotSpotter has a lot of critics. And I said, no, I don't believe that's true. We have loud critics for sure, but I don't think we have a lot of critics. And they'll say, well, Chicago. And I say, no, not Chicago. The Chicago mayor has said he does not support ShotSpotter. And there are some activists in Chicago who don't support ShotSpotter. But the police chief in Chicago supports ShotSpotter. And if you look at the vote from the aldermen, what we see is there's very strong support from the electorate in Chicago, people who are close to the voice of those in the community. And there was a really great report out of, I think maybe the Gothamist, a week or so ago, just about hot spots of policing. And I wish I had the quote right in front of me, but it basically says, the people who live in the communities most affected by violence overwhelmingly say they are happy when they see the police show up. And I think too often we paint with a broad brush, and we hear people talk about over-policing. But I think there are people that live in communities that have been plagued by gun violence, that don't want it, that do want to see police show up. You're absolutely right. Police knocking on your door is a stressful event. Even if you're a law-abiding citizen, you might be concerned that others in the neighborhood would see you talking to uniformed law enforcement and think you are cooperating, and you might be the victim of retaliation. I think police are sensitive to that. And so even while a person is shaking their head, no, I don't want to talk to you, they're saying, leave me your card and I will call you. Because they really do want effective law enforcement. And I think that that is true. If you look at sentiment surveys, there is support for ShotSpotter. So I believe that most law-abiding people, and I think even in places where there are high rates of gun violence, most of the people in those communities are law-abiding. They want good policing. And I think ShotSpotter is one tool that can be a part of that. To the question about whether or not ShotSpotter improves investigative efficacy, I think, again, looking back at the tool analogy, how you use it determines the results you'll see. And in some of the places where our customers have done a really good job of tracking data, what we do see are results. So I'll point to Winston-Salem. They had an academic that analyzed the data. And I watched the captain who was responsible for implementing it speak publicly about the results of their initial use. And she reported that they had arrested 17 people directly, but 51 people indirectly. And I think that that's evidence of the value of investigative follow-up. There's also research that shows if you contribute investigative resources to crimes, you are more likely to see success. We put the most effort in trying to solve homicides. That makes sense because it's our most serious offense and because we want justice for victims. But we don't usually put as much effort into non-fatal shootings, which far outnumber fatal shootings, and often are non-fatal simply because of luck. Those are would-be murders, and if you arrest those offenders, you prevent them from committing other offenses. And we're starting to see places where law enforcement are contributing the same investigative resources to following up on those non-fatal and non-contact shootings as they do homicides, and they increase their clearance rate. And I think failure to address violent crime in the communities most affected by it is itself a root cause of violence. If people who commit crimes feel like they will not be held accountable, they are emboldened, they will commit more crimes. If you can identify them and arrest them and incarcerate them, you will prevent every future crime they would commit after that. And I think there's a lot of value in that. Anyways, I think that that is a big part of why ShotSpotter is important and also has much broader public support than some of the news headlines would suggest.
Am I allowed to ask Tom questions?
No.
It's $5.
Yeah.
If the answer is no, I'll follow rules, man. I'll sit back in my Glen.
No. Of course.
You have to
Go
take
ahead,
a
Eric.
shot first.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, as the professor on the call, right, I feel like I can't resist commenting on the research, right? So first thing, Tom's 100% correct about citizens of high crime neighborhoods and hot spots welcoming police presence. I think one of the myths is too strong of a word, but maybe I'll stay with myths. I've been drinking whiskey. One of the myths that dominates this discussion is that people who live in high crime neighborhoods despise police presence. Research is clear that that's not the case, right? Even when people generally have pretty unfavorable views of police, they are supportive of police presence for the purpose of preventing crime, right? So wanted to say that because I think that's a research finding that doesn't get discussed nearly enough for whatever reason. Now, the research on ShotSpotter, I want to make a couple of things clear, right? So Tom mentioned the one study out of Winston-Salem that found a reduction of crime following the introduction of ShotSpotter. Counting our study, we were able to find 15 total research projects that analyzed the effect of ShotSpotter on crime prevention. The only two that found evidence of a crime reduction were the Winston-Salem study and another study conducted in Cincinnati. It's important to note that both of those studies were done by the same research team, and neither one of those studies were peer-reviewed. So 13 of the 15 studies did not find any evidence of crime reduction.
And
This
some
notion of
grad
hotspots, say again, I'm sorry.
Some grad student somewhere is just salivating thinking about meta-analyzing those 15 studies and making a name for themselves.
Go for it. But to this notion of hotspots, Tom, this is the question I have. I've been wondering this a lot, so right, and let me take 30 seconds to define what I mean and what research means by hotspot, right? Hotspots are not neighborhoods, right? Hotspots are not large areas, right? And when police define hotspots as those large places, that's when they get in trouble, right? So things like increased stop question frisks in large neighborhoods, that's not hotspots policing. Hotspots are very small, confined areas. And that's important to note because research for the last 40 years has consistently shown that the vast majority of serious crime happens in an incredibly small number of these tiny places, right? So for an example, systematic review conducted by David Weisberg and his colleagues found that on average, research that asked the question, how many crimes happen at these small places, finds that about 5% of city blocks. Research suggests that a very small number of these small places account for the majority of crime, right? So for an example, research consistently reports that only about 5% of city blocks house over half of the overall crime incidents in a city, right? And that's been reported across all cities that type of analysis has been done. It's probably even more concentrated in terms of serious gun violence, right? So for example, in an unpublished analysis I conducted recently, I found that 4% of blocks in Boston account for 100% of the shootings. So all of the shootings over a 5-year period happened in 4% of places. So now my question for Tom. ShotSpotter, it's not, relatively speaking, right, depending on how you look at the numbers, right, it's not cheap. And I think a lot of the controversy has to do with how much it costs to install this system, right? So by SoundThinking's own website, this costs between $65,000 and $90,000 per square mile per year. So when you have cities like Chicago, for example, covering 136 square miles, multiply that by $60,000 to $90,000, then you can see why the public may question why whether or not it's worth the investment. But what we know about hotspots, Tom, right? And if a small number of places house the vast majority of gun violence incidents, is it possible to install ShotSpotter in fewer places but have a similar effect? Can you cover a block in ShotSpotter, or do you have to cover miles and miles for the technology to work the way it's intended?
So there's a lot in there. First, I didn't cite Winston-Salem for its conclusion about crime reduction, but rather arrests. And I think that there's a downside to using crime reduction as the singular measure of ShotSpotter's value. I think there's other measures that are more important, and I'll get to those. I agree with Eric, and everything that I have seen suggests that the shootings are concentrated in a small number of places, but those number of places are not like one dot on a map. And so even though it's 4% of city blocks, those 4% may be spread out over 30% of this city. ShotSpotter installations are customized. The customer determines what the coverage area is, and it doesn't have to be a precise square mile. It can be contoured to where the issue is. With respect to how much the system costs, I think that is a relative matter, and I don't think it's expensive when you compare it to the economic impact of gun crime in general. And these two things are related, the measures of the system's success and its value. So very often I will hear people say, ShotSpotter doesn't reduce crime. And I would say, okay, can you please show me the one thing that does reduce crime? Because we should be investing all of our money in that thing. There is no such thing, right? There's no singular tool that can reduce gun violence. It's a complex social issue. Not that reducing crime isn't an important goal and a measure worth looking at, but it's not the singular measure. More important, so another thing, look at how many of these alerts resulted in immediate arrests. And I'll say, well, immediate arrests are a measure and an important measure. And we know from the case law and from statistics that our customers track that ShotSpotter very often does lead to immediate arrests. I think the research has had a much more difficult time of quantifying the downstream arrests that result from investigations. But even still, immediate arrests are not the most important measure. I think the greater measure is how often does ShotSpotter help police locate gunshot wound victims, either where there was no corresponding 911 call, or at least faster than they might have otherwise found that victim with a 911 call. And Eric's research says 93 seconds. And I submit when you're suffering from a gunshot wound, those 93 seconds probably matter to you. And we know that from the experience of customers across the country, ShotSpotter is very often the only thing that leads them to gunshot wound victims. And what's the value of the lives of those people? Now, if we're being honest, some of those people that ShotSpotter helps police locate will die no matter what. Their wounds are not survivable. In those cases, I still think there's value in getting police on scene quickly so that they can collect ephemeral evidence, so they can locate witnesses before they flee, so that hopefully we can get justice for those victims. And there are some gunshot wound victims who would not die from their wounds. It was a mere flesh wound. But in between, there are people who are seriously wounded and need aid. If ShotSpotter can help get them there faster and save even a life or two, actuaries would tell you it has more than paid for itself. Now, I think it is hard to put a dollar value on human life, but if you ask those victims and their families what it was worth, I think they would say priceless. Thankfully, the system is not priceless. It's very affordable. Eric hits the number about right. Ballpark figure, $70,000 per square mile. If you do the math, that is $7.99. Per year. $70,000 per square mile per year. Divide that out. That is $7.99 an hour to monitor for gunshot information. That is a drop in the bucket compared to some of the other costs that we may spend. The other thing I'll sometimes see critics say is, we have to forego all other things for ShotSpotter. They present this false either or. Like you can only have ShotSpotter or police staffing, only have ShotSpotter or civil rights. And I just think that's nonsense. You can have both, and we should. We should be adequately funding and resourcing police. One last thing I'll say about using the tool. I really do believe the best policing is like politics. It's local. You really do have to customize a strategy that focuses on your specific crime issues and locale. Like Eric points out, crime isn't everywhere. It's not like peanut butter spread evenly. And so we should be focusing our resources in the place where it can do the greatest good. I wish every city had ShotSpotter across the whole thing. But if you can't have it there, at least put it in the place where it can do the greatest good.
If I could have a quick response, Charlie, before your next question. Only so to clarify rather the research observations. Yeah, so Tom, you're correct. You didn't mention the Winston-Salem study. You didn't mention that one to talk about the crime reduction benefits of ShotSpotter. You mentioned it to talk about the benefits in apprehending shooters. Of the 15 studies we found, 0 found any significant effects of ShotSpotter on case clearance. The studies that have talked about the arrests that happened in response of ShotSpotter, all of those studies had no control group, right? So in other words, they're giving you the ShotSpotter statistic without comparing it to what business as usual is. You all are nice people, so I won't go into a research methods discussion, but that's not science, right? Like for you to say something either worked or didn't, you need to compare it to a control condition. So all of the research that has identified arrests increasing after ShotSpotter has not compared it to the counterfactual. The second, actually, and I think, Tom, did you want to respond? I think your video was a little in and out.
So only to offer an anecdote, you mentioned that I went to law school. I also went to grad school at night. I got a master's in criminology. Very early in my ATF career, I went at night. And I went thinking that I was going to learn better policing, resource deployment, that sort of thing. What I found was that police are the coercive arm of the ruling elite intended to maintain status quo. It was pretty left-leaning. I still learned a lot from it, including things about research methods, and I think what Eric is saying is all true. But I remember even back then thinking, man, if we could get academics and practitioners together instead of being miles apart, we could really make some progress. And I do commend Eric. He, more than many researchers I see, have tried to bring his research into the mainstream, engage with the audience, make it practical. Anyways, that was just an observation. When you talk about all of these research studies, I think there are probably a lot of researchers that are predisposed to trying to reach those conclusions. Present company excluded, of course.
So researchers are intentionally doing research to say ShotSpotter doesn't work?
Well, I do think that there is a tendency to believe that there must be a reason it doesn't. I also think that if you look solely at police information, you may also see that same sort of bias. But yeah, I think that academia tends to have a left bias to it. And I think that a lot of the research I see overlooks some of the other important factors.
Rick, did you look at any qualitative related data to this instead of just numbers-based stuff that may have
We
other
didn't.
results?
We didn't. We tried to get our hands on like the shots fired reports, for example, right? So one idea we had was to maybe do like a qualitative coding of the description of the response in the 911 calls. We just weren't able to get that, so we weren't able to pursue that. I have a really crazy research idea involving analyzing body camera video of police officers responding to ShotSpotter to get a little bit of sense of what exactly are they doing, right? So I mentioned before that using the GPS coordinates, we found that officers do indeed spend more time on shooting scenes when responding to ShotSpotter. And obvious question is, what are they doing? Right. So Tom articulated before that, an assumed benefit is that they're trying to engage with people. They're trying to reassure people that they heard the gunfire, that they're responding to the gunfire. It'll be fantastic to analyze body camera video to see if that's happening more often on ShotSpotter scenes than 911 calls. Another thing that we hoped to do, but we weren't able to, and this speaks to some of the issues Tom was talking about, we hoped to get individual level information about gun victimization, gunshot location, right? We're interested in this question of survivability. It's one thing to say that shootings, fatal and non-fatal, did not go up or down in either city. It's another thing to say, were people more or less likely to expire after being shot in ShotSpotter areas? To do that analysis responsibly, we felt we needed information on location of gunshot wound, because if someone gets shot in the head, for example, in the ShotSpotter area, as researchers, we thought it was irresponsible to compare that to a case outside of the ShotSpotter area where someone was shot in the leg, for example. We weren't able to get that information, so we didn't really pursue that research question. To my knowledge, only one research study has been able to do that. It was a study conducted out of Camden, New Jersey, where they were able to account for location of gunshot wound. And what they found was that ShotSpotter cases were associated with quicker police and ambulance time, also were associated with quicker time from location of the crime to the hospital. However, they found that ShotSpotter was not associated with increased survivability of gunshot wounds. That's only one study, though, right? I mean, Tom makes some really good points about survivability being a potential very important benefit of ShotSpotter, and if you could save some lives, then $65,000 to $90,000 per square mile per year does become much more affordable. Research hasn't been able to do a great job of isolating that effect yet.
So, full disclosure, this is not the first time Eric and I have spoken. And I have to confess that I like him very much. And I think that he has a great sense of humor. He will even tell you that he became a research because he wasn't sure his stand-up comedy career was going to take off. But the reason that he and I spoke for the first time was I read some of his early research. And I reached out to him and I said, hey, I read in here, it looks to me like your research suggests that some tactics may be advisable, like scoop and run. So traditionally, police show up on scene, there's a gunshot wound victim, they call for emergency aid, and then an ambulance shows up 5 minutes later. And then the ambulance transports that person. But in some places, police have been transporting themselves, saving that 5 minutes. Now, there's a trade-off. Police driving a gunshot wound victim to the hospital aren't applying the aid that EMS may be in the back of the ambulance. But there's at least some reason to believe that might be a strategy that saves lives too. And I asked him, hey, why didn't you make those recommendations in your report? I'm coming from, at this point, an ATF background where a lot of the research that I saw was conducted by outside oversight agencies, and they always came with recommendations. He said, well, I would need evidence to support that. That isn't the thing that my research looked into. I think that's an example of how there's still a lot to be done. But Cassie, you point out about qualitative research, and I think there's value in anecdotes. So we should not be making broad proclamations on anecdotes, right? We need quantitative research to say, hey, we think, like the evidence shows what our gut tells us. But a lot of this research focuses on percentages and overlooks the nominal numbers. And so when you start looking at that, very often you're talking about a lot of real world cases, and even a few people saved matters. And so that's not always captured by this big picture research, but I think it's important not to overlook things like victims.
I want to just come back to something that Tom said earlier, because I think you made a really good point. But first, I want to point out that $7.99 an hour per block thing, that was peak salesman speak, man. That was the absolute best I've ever heard. Like, you took that from massive investment to $7.99 an hour. I'm going to start doing that with, like, data. I'm going to be like, an enterprise system is $100,000, but that's only 0.08 cents per row of data. So you can't afford... No, I thought that was great. You're right. The left lean in academia and the media when it comes to assessing law enforcement, that's a very real thing. I don't know anybody that I respect that if I asked them, what should law enforcement be doing? What's effective? That they would be like, let's ask the mayor of Chicago, because they've really got it squared away there. But you made a really great point. What exactly does work? And so, Eric, you obviously are very familiar with the body of literature on ShotSpotter, but I know that also crime prevention generally has been your jams for a long time. You've done a lot of research with CCTV cameras and the implementation of crime analysis and data-driven policing, different technologies. If I were the chief of police and I said, Eric, I've got limited resources, but I want to put it all into crime reduction, what exactly would you say? What would you advise me based on a prolific body of data that says XYZ works in terms of reducing crime?
Yeah, certainly. So the body of policing research indicates some pretty clear lessons, right? First, focusing on places can be a little bit more efficient than focusing on people. I spoke before about how highly concentrated in space crime is. That's good news. That means that where crime happens and also when it happens, it's highly predictable, right? So police can target that a little bit easier than they could target criminal careers and predict exactly when people are going to be more criminally involved than at other times in their life. Proactive policing activities work much better than reactive policing activities. Problem-solving approaches, where police customize their responses according to the exact underlying situational problems, work much better than strategies that are cookie-cutter approaches, right? Well, we did that on that side of the town last year and it worked okay. Let's do that in this part of the town, right? And every time we have a problem, let's do the exact same thing. Being intentional about understanding the problems and crafting solutions to solve those problems works much better. The problem with technology is the way technology is often deployed in policing violates all of those lessons, right? Rather than analyzing exactly where crime is the highest, a lot of technology, and ShotSpotter excluded, right? So ShotSpotter does begin with an analysis of gunfire, but a lot of other technologies are just installed where it's easy to install. Let's put a CCTV camera on this street corner because there's a tall enough pole, or because the owner of that building doesn't mind the police drilling a camera into the side, right? Whether or not that's an appropriate crime prevention location is well down the list, right? So that's a problem. A lot of technology emphasizes reacting to crime rather than proactively addressing it. A lot of technology isn't leveraged in a way to help police understand the underlying situational problems that make hotspots to begin with. So the key is, if you want to use a technology-driven solution, try to figure out a way to leverage the technology in a way that targets hotspots a little bit better, that rather than supports police responding to incidents, helps police better understand why incidents are occurring in the first place to proactively do something to prevent these incidents from happening. From using technology in a way that helps police better understand the local context so that they can develop customized solutions rather than just using cookie-cutter approaches everywhere where they have problems in the city.
You mentioned problem-solving approaches. Maybe in Kansas City was too small, but the SARA model, scan, analyze, respond, assess. The first step is look out and see where your problems are. Were there any efforts in Chicago to use their massive area that has ShotSpotter, and as part of that scan process where we say, all right, hey, all of a sudden shots started going off in this particular area as opposed to that one? Or are gunshots so concentrated and so stable that there really wouldn't be different data analysis from week to week?
That's a really good question, right? And it's hard to say because at this point, so much of Chicago is covered that I'm not sure if they've actually passed the point of return of being focused, right? Because again, just so much of the city is covered. I'm not sure how much hotspot presence actually drove the installation at this point. And it's also hard to say because, again, frankly, as I said before, I don't have the necessary relationships. I don't have the type of relationships with the Chicago PD that I have with the Kansas City PD that allow me much insight to say exactly how it's being leveraged nowadays.
So, Tom, I had a question for you. You're what we call in the industry a vendor. Whenever I was a crime analyst myself, I actually once put together a presentation and submitted it for a proposal called "Never Ever Ever Trust a Vendor." Thankfully, it didn't get accepted, and a couple years later, I myself was a vendor. So, I guess it really is true. You either die a hero or live long enough to see yourself become a vendor. But I think that I think that's just indicative. Law enforcement is incredibly mistrusting. It is a difficult group to sell to. And whenever one of the very first things that any law enforcement agency does when they're considering a vendor is they look for the failures. And there have been some cities who got ShotSpotter and then for whatever reason did away with it. I think one of the things that people on the inside of law enforcement don't really appreciate as much as they should is that there are often responsibilities that the customer has that they can drop the ball on. And police departments are not project-based organizations. And what we're talking about is not downloading Microsoft Word and banging out a document. This is a large-scale implementation process. As Eric mentioned, it requires management. And management, I think that there are a lot of crime analysts out there that will tell you they got hired because somebody said we want to do data-driven policing and we want to manage with data. And then they get 2 years into it and it's really kind of all the same. And now we got this analyst and they're not doing anything. So when you think about the places that have got ShotSpotter and then done away with it for whatever reason, do you see that what sort of problems do you see that ultimately leads to that? Is it that the technology didn't work in that particular place? Was it that there were issues with implementation? Was it that the customer dropped the ball? There wasn't a change in management practices? What sort of things do you see in those particular cities?
So to your first point, I became painfully aware of that almost immediately. So I spent nearly 27 years in service to my country. And then I came to the private sector and everyone was immediately suspicious of my commercial motives, as if somehow I had become a mercenary, which wounded me deeply because I am very committed to these issues. So I came to this company because I saw incredible potential in its technology to help improve policing, save lives, and reduce crime. This is very easy for me to talk about because I believe strongly in it. But your point is well taken. Really, when I think back to my time working in the federal government, I consistently gave every vendor I encountered the stiff arm. And that included guys that I had known when they were on the job, and then they reach out and they're like, "Hey, Tom, you want to grab lunch?" And I was like, "I'm not buying anything, if that's what you mean." Which now, in retrospect, I see made me kind of a jerk. And it also, so this is something that's a point. I started out in the federal government as a GS4, which is, if you know anything about the pay structure in the federal government, very ranking. And when I left, I was the number 2 in charge of the ATF. So I had worked my way up there. And every step along the way, I would look back and think, oh my God, there was so much stuff I didn't know. But I thought eventually I would stop having that experience. How's it possible I keep getting promoted with all these things I don't know? And then I came to the private sector and I got hit with that again. Oh my God, how did I not read these things? First of all, I didn't understand the full potential of ShotSpotter. I spend a lot of time proselytizing about that now and telling people, hey, here are the things I did not see before that this technology can help you do. Please use it better. But I also didn't realize the value of engaging with the private sector. There are a lot of smart people working over here. And like some of them don't want to be on the front line, carrying firearms, making arrests, putting themselves directly in harm's way. But that doesn't mean that they aren't contributing to important social goals. And so that is my plea to people to at least keep an open mind when you encounter vendors. Second thing, I would dispute that ShotSpotter has failed anywhere. That places everything on the technology, and I don't think that that is an accurate assessment. So I see the same criticism in the news over and over and over again. Cities across the country are canceling ShotSpotter. And when they say that, they list the same handful of cities, literally a number that I can count on my fingers, that have canceled over the last, say, decade. But what they don't point to is the 170 active customers, 170 plus active customers. And this is true. In the last year alone, more customers have expanded their coverage area of ShotSpotter than have discontinued service in the company's entire history. We have an incredibly high retention rate, but I think that there's an intentional effort to mislead people into believing, hey, the technology doesn't work, and so people are banning it right and left. I already talked about people painting with a broad brush. Oh, Chicago, no. Brandon Johnson, the Chicago mayor. Oh, New York, no. The comptroller of New York. You can look at his report and see NYPD completely rejects his conclusions. And so I don't think ShotSpotter has failed anywhere. I think the factors that you point to are important ones. Did the customer go into it with a clear understanding of what would be required to make it successful, to use it, to respond to it effectively? There are probably a lot of decisions that go into running a large city. I have never been a city administrator. I've never been elected to office. I know that you have competing demands. And so for those cities that have discontinued, I wouldn't want to speculate about what their motivation was, but I don't think that it's because ShotSpotter has failed. Rather, maybe there wasn't a champion. Maybe they didn't have a good implementation strategy. Maybe there were outside forces that pushed it out even when they wanted to keep it.
In the sake of transparency, since I studied Chicago and Chicago's mayor is trying to cancel the contract, I should probably say that I did present findings of this research project to the team a week before they came out with that cancellation decision. I had no contact with them, right? I mean, they learned of our research project. I kind of explained earlier about how all of my contacts left the city of Chicago. They asked to have a discussion. I'll speak to anyone about it. To be perfectly blatant, though, like I'm not entirely sure that the findings of my research played any role in their decision making. I mean, Brandon Johnson ran partially, and this was a large part of his campaign, on canceling ShotSpotter. So I don't think there was anything that I could have told the mayor's office in that meeting that would have changed their mind, to be perfectly honest.
So I have to revise my answer. In Chicago, Brandon Johnson, some activist organizations, and Eric Piza want to cancel ShotSpotter. I'm kidding. Hey, look, to Eric's credit, he already disclosed that publicly in an article. Yeah. And recently, Eric and I appeared at more or less the same time, not together and not coordinated, at a city council hearing in Boston. And there he struck an intentionally neutral tone. I'm not here to make I'm not here to make policy recommendations. I'm here to give you facts. I do think that his research has been co-opted by people who are anti-ShotSpotter. I think you can read the same research, and I very often do, as, wow, there's a lot of value that comes from ShotSpotter. If you look at the singular measure and some of the others that Eric has pointed out, you might say, oh, it didn't work. But if you look at all the others, faster response, greater awareness, more precision, more arrests, more evidence, to me that sounds like a successful tool.
And I was going to say something nice about Tom before he said something nice about me there, I promise. But so Tom, I want to commend you for like rising above the, for lack of a better term, very toxic nature around the public debate with ShotSpotter, right? It's for some reason we have two extreme camps that dominate the public debate around this. It's one side, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to society, and it's, you know, the most racist thing ever. And on the other side is, this is the greatest intervention in the history of policing. It's been interesting to me that every time I publish an article on ShotSpotter, we're publishing an article on one specific finding. I could be called either anti-police in response to what I publish, or I could be called a pro-police apologist. I've been called both, and it's kind of hysterical. Sometimes I'm called both on social media in response to the same research article that I publish. It would be in Tom's best interest as a salesman and a vendor to have that shallow of a binary view of this, right? It may be in his best interest, or at least it'll be easy. Maybe best interest is overstating it. It would be very easy for Tom to treat me the same way when I publish something that he may not totally agree with or like. But the fact that we've been on here, we've spent over an hour kind of discussing, I think there's a lot Tom and I agree on. There's certainly some things that we disagree on, but I appreciate Tom for being willing to engage in these conversations and to come from it from a very objective, reasoned standpoint. Far too many people come at this discussion from a very different place.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I really do believe that reasonable people can disagree, and I think you can disagree without being disagreeable. It honestly shocks me the zero-sum stance that we so often see, because there's just so much more common ground, I really do believe, between all of us in this country on a lot of issues. And I really do try to keep an open mind. So I'm grateful for you saying that. I will tell you that it's pretty easy for me to do this. So I spent a couple of hours talking to staffers for some elected officials, answering any question they asked me about ShotSpotter. And at the end, I said, look, I genuinely do not know if the council member you represent is pro-ShotSpotter or anti-ShotSpotter, but it does not matter to me. If they support it, great. I would like to make sure that they understand ways to advocate for it. If they oppose it, I want to at least make sure that they're opposing it based on a truly informed opinion, and that I can respond to any misunderstandings or misperceptions they have. I will tell you, Eric, you're in good company. In a single week when I was at ATF, the agency was sued by California for under-enforcing the law, and the subject of an NRA letter writing campaign for over-enforcing the law. And so I said, the true measure of ATF's effectiveness is if it has made 100% of America unhappy with it. So not the place I'm sure you want to find yourself, Eric, but I really do admire you for trying to be out in the open about your research and trying to bring what can be dense issues to lots of people. Eric, another thing you'll see if you start, not Eric, I'm saying this to everyone about Eric. If you start trying to keep up with academic research, what you're going to find is a lot of it's behind paywalls. Eric goes out of his way to make his research accessible, and I think that's commendable.
Thank you, Tom.
I'll also just throw it out there. I appreciate that Tom's willing to come on and talk about the kind of gray area. I think a lot of times law enforcement are used to people in sales coming in, and it's all shiny, and it's all easy, and it's all simple, and it's all a magic bullet, and that's just an immediate turnoff. And so just being able to get down into the muck and talk about some of these details, I really appreciate it. Tom, I did want to ask you one question kind of a personal nature. So a lot of what I spend my time talking about with crime analysts who work in police departments are career growth and ultimately leaving law enforcement and going to the private sector. And for analysts, there's a huge job market out there. I think it's much bigger than what they find in law enforcement. But still, even when we talk about better money, better growth, better pay, whatever, a lot of analysts who have spent 5-10 years in law enforcement agencies have this perception that the private sector is risky. You're going to be detached from the mission. It's not going to be as fulfilling. But you don't really seem to give that vibe. So just on sort of a personal, professional level, can you just speak to that analyst briefly that's got all the potential in the world? They're not growing anymore in their law enforcement agency. They're thinking about the private sector, but they have those concerns in their mind.
Well, of course, that's a personal decision to make. But over the course of my career, I saw a big change in law enforcement. When I started out, an agent like me could work a case soup to nuts by him or herself. By the time I retired, it really did require a team approach. There's so much more specialization. There are so many tools that are difficult to use, intelligence tools, for instance. And what a lot of us were observing was the composition of the law enforcement profession hadn't changed to keep up with that. if you want to be intelligence-led, you have to have intelligence professionals that can help analyze it. And so I actually do think the market for government intel analysts and that sort of occupation is going to continue growing. At the same time, as I have learned coming over to the private sector, there is so much information available that smart companies are trying to use their data for a lot of purposes. So I have said before, when I was at ATF, all I ever thought about was investigating, arresting, and prosecuting gun offenders. It did not occur to me that aggregate gunfire data might be useful for anything other than that. But of course, I have learned so much from the smart people at this company. Using this data, you can use it to measure the efficacy of laws. You can draw conclusions about trends in crime. And so the private sector is going to depend also on an increasing segment of the workforce that is data-driven, can understand and use these tools, can conduct analytics. And of course, I think AI is going to help with some of that, but we're still going to have people who understand how to use AI. You asked about some of the differences, and there are some pretty salient differences between public service and private sector. There is a sense of job security in the government service that is not present in the private sector. Very often, companies get bought, they go private, they expand or contract, and so that has consequences. There's also the potential for making a great deal of money in the private sector. And somebody who thinks that there isn't meaningful work to be had in the private sector hasn't worked for a company like SoundThinking. So I sometimes joke, I feel grateful that I work here because this is such easy technology to talk about. And my friends that have gone to work for like equipment suppliers must have it harder. Illumination is important, but I would have a hard time getting jazzed about selling flashlights. And so there are really companies out there that are doing work that matters. That's a thing that drives us here. One thing we didn't get to, but you asked me early on, was why the company had changed its name. When I came here, it was called ShotSpotter. ShotSpotter is still the acoustic gunshot detection tool we've been talking about, but this company has much more to offer than just that. People don't know it, but ShotSpotter, the company, ran the company that completely manages NYPD's records management, all of its investigative files, personnel files, traffic tickets, towing reports. But you wouldn't think about buying a case management software from ShotSpotter. And so the company rebranded to SoundThinking, which pays homage, of course, to the company's origins. But we also have a patrol management solution. We have the case management solution. We have a distributed database solution. Recently, we announced a strategic partnership with a license plate reader company. So now we have an LPR solution. Just evidence that there is going to continue to be increased focus on using multiple tools for good effect. So anyways, there are definitely pros and cons. I think you can find satisfying, meaningful work in either. I loved my public service. I am glad I got to serve my country. It was something to be able to stand up and say, I'm here on behalf of the United States. But working for this company has shown me that there's a lot of good you can do in the private sector too.
Jason, Cassie, you guys have been uncharacteristically quiet tonight. I don't want to hog the stage.
Yes, and I've been sitting still.
What are you guys drinking? I've been curious about that all night.
Oh,
I'm recovering from a cold, so this is some loose leaf raspberry elderberry tea.
Party time.
You got some booze in it?
No, because I don't think my cold medicine and booze would
Cassie,
go together.
this is not elderberry tea and crime analysis, all right? We'll talk about this off the air. Okay. Jason, what about you?
I recently had a trip to Louisville, Kentucky, and I picked up a local rabbit hole
Went down a rabbit
bourbon.
hole.
And so that's what I'm drinking this evening on the rocks.
Nice.
Well, in honor of tonight's discussion, I tried to make a cocktail I was going to call the Shots Fired. It was Hot Shots, which is basically Fireball mixed with Screwball, which is peanut butter bourbon. So it's supposed to be a peanut butter cinnamon bourbon. Didn't
that
really
work out
turn
for you?
out the way that I was hoping for, so we won't be putting that one in the archives. But I'm going to take it back to the lab.
Peanut butter and cinnamon. You're like, yes, in my mind, this is gonna be a great idea.
I thought so.
Well, you needed to put the pop rocks in there so it makes the pop sound.
Oh, that's what it
snap,
should have been.
Jason.
Should have been a Pop Rocks drink. Oh,
Yeah.
missed
Could've done that on the
opportunity.
air, poured it in.
Yeah.
So until this moment, it did not occur to me that there should be a drink called the ShotSpotter.
There you go.
So next time I come back on, I'm gonna have some suggestions for what that might be. But
I'm
it
gonna
sounds
be
like
thinking
you
about
guys
it,
are
yeah.
almost there.
Yeah.
Eric, I have one last question I want to run by you. And this is an idea that I saw circulated in the comments section when you posted your research somewhere. But it was kind of reevaluating what is the goal of ShotSpotter, what should the goal of ShotSpotter be. And so if it's not crime reduction, if it's harm reduction, if it's saving lives, if it's faster interventions, should it be police departments that are leading the way in implementing this, or should it be hospitals, the medical community? Is that who should be looking at this technology? Any thoughts on that?
That's a great question. I haven't formed an opinion myself, but I have spoken to people within police agencies who have made that same suggestion, right? Saying that the police are not the only agency benefiting from ShotSpotter. Some officers have argued to me that you can make an argument that police are not even the agency that's benefiting most from ShotSpotter. So maybe there should be some kind of cost sharing model where police are not the only agency responsible for paying for it. That's wasn't the answer you're looking for, Charlie, but
No, it's fine.
people active in law enforcement have raised that same point to me.
Tom, any research on the subject? Any marketing efforts to the medical community from ShotSpotter side?
So I'm glad you asked. So I mentioned novel uses of the technology. We talked about how crime is not distributed evenly across the landscape, and neither should the resources, non-police resources that we use to support crime victims. I think that you can use ShotSpotter for a lot of other things. Research is just now emerging to say that chronic exposure to gunfire, even when you're not the direct victim, has adverse effects on the health of young people. And I think using precisely geolocated information like ShotSpotter can help us identify those kids that would benefit most from it. I think in the years to come, you are going to see incredible advances in how technology is used to enhance public safety in all sorts of ways.
Well, I think that was an incredibly optimistic and future-looking note for us to wrap this show up on because, as you guys can see, my shots fired has runneth dry. So, Eric and Tom, want to thank you guys for being on with us. Thank you so much for lending your expertise. This has been a great conversation. And Jason, Cassie, of course, I'll see you guys in a week or two when we get together and do this again.